Hi guys, this is Peugeot 307SW from 2005 and today we're going to replace CV joint. So first of all we need to jack up the car and secure it, and afterwards we will remove the wheel in order to get the access to the locking cap and remove it. So take a look at me doing that, and in the meantime I'm going to tell you a bit more about the video. I will cover both right and left CV joint replacement, but I will focus on the right one. And I will show you the parts that are different for the left one after I've done the right one. So at the end you will see the whole process for both left and right side. And just for you to know, the right one is a bit more complicated because it has an intermediate bearing, and therefore I believe that it's better that you see the whole process for the right one and just parts that are different for the left one. Okay, so now that I've used the hammer to remove the pin, I can freely remove the cap and then I can start working on the nut. But it's better to spray it with lubrication first because this nut is torqued with over 300 Newton meters and therefore it's not easy to remove it. When I've done that, I put the wheel back on, and the arrangement that you see here is the end result of my struggle to remove this nut. I used another jack to lift one side of the lever, and then I stood on the other side with my 90 kilos, and then my friend hit the lever with the hammer, and only then the nut went loose. So you might have some better tools and that would be great, but I didn't. And by the way, the key size is 36, so it's not something regular to have in the workshop, or at least not for me. Now we can double check that the nut is loose, and if it is, we can start to work on the nuts of the wheel to remove it once more. It's quite a lot of this back and forth with the wheel, but it's just the way to do it. We need to live with that. So when the wheel is off, we can freely remove the nut, and then we can start to focus on two bolts connecting the shock absorber to the spindle. We need to remove them because we will need to relocate the spindle together with the braking disc out of its normal position, and we need to do that because we need place to remove the CV joint from the inside of the spindle. It will take us some time with these bolts, and in the meantime I'm going to tell you additional thing about the video. So there are two parts of this video. One is oil filling and draining, and the second part is removing the CV joint from CV axle, which I've already uploaded to YouTube. And I wouldn't like you guys that have subscribed to make you watch this twice, and therefore I have increased the speed on this part of the video. So the overall length of the video is not 40 minutes but 22 instead. And you can watch the things that are new to you instead of watching enormously long video with a lot of repetitions from before. So for you guys that are new to the channel, I will put the links in the description and at the end of the video, so you have an easy reference for the other videos and you can just click and check them out if you'd like to have full details on the oil filling, draining, or removing the CV joint from CV axle. So in both cases you are fully covered. Just use the references, or if you know that already, just sit back and enjoy the video. Okay, so now we're at the part when we need to remove the CV joint from the spindle. It can take some time to do that, and what I figured out to be very helpful is when you get into the car and you move the steering wheel one way or another and find the best spot to pull the CV joint out of the spindle. At the beginning you can pull the brake disc towards you and gently hit the face of CV joint with a hammer. By the face I mean the part where the nut used to sit. And that will help you to get the CV joint out of the spindle. And remember that when you pull the brake disc towards you, you need to watch out for the hydraulic cable supplying braking fluid to the caliper, because in an older car it's very easy to break that. So you need to watch out not to increase the time and the cost of repair. When we finally succeed in the struggle to remove the CV joint from the spindle, we still cannot remove the CV axle from the gearbox. And one of the reasons is because the oil level in the gearbox is above the differential, and therefore if we wanted to remove the CV axle, we would get the leak straight on the floor. So before we proceed with the CV axle removal, we need to drain the oil level. As I said, I have already covered that through another video, and therefore I'm going to run through this part really quick and focus on the next step of CV joint replacement. If you'd like more details, just follow the links in the description or the reference I give you at the end of this video. In the short summary, we need to open up the hood, remove part of the airline to get the access to the vent cap on top of the gearbox, remove it, and then go under the car, locate the correct drain plug. We don't want to drain the engine oil, we want to drain the transmission oil. And then prepare big enough bucket for the oil. For this car, 3 liters will be enough. Afterwards, simply remove the drain plug and drain the oil. Now that we have removed the oil from the gearbox, we can start to work on the axle. And as I said, the right axle is different from the left one because the right one is longer and it has an intermediate bearing. So before we can remove the right axle, we need to unlock the bearing because there are 2 locking pins that are keeping the bearing in place. And you need to remove these 2 nuts first in order to unlock the pins. You will find this bearing area in the middle section of the right CV axle. So it's approximately the same distance from the gearbox to the bearing area as it is from the bearing area to the right CV joint. And as you see, it's right next to the drain plug for the engine oil. Now, this perspective that you see here is me having my head right next to the gearbox and looking at the bearing area. Once we have loosened these 2 nuts or removed them completely, as I have done in this video, we need to switch to the other side of the bearing area. So we need to keep our head right next to the CV joint and look at the bearing area. There you will find these 2 locking pins that you need to rotate outwards so they are not blocking the bearing when we will remove the CV axle together with the bearing. Okay, so now we will use this tool and pure force to press the CV axle, or the bearing actually, because it's the bearing that holds the axle in place. So we will use this tool and press the bearing out, and then the rest is easy peasy. So we go under the car, we find the perfect spot, which is in the bearing area on the side of the wheel. And since I've used approx half an hour, not including the brakes, to do that, I'm going to share a bit of how to do that with you. So you don't want to put the lever on the bolt there connected to the rubber part, because you will most likely destroy the rubber part. You want to put it a bit to the left. Parts there are solid and you can get a good grip and good press to pull it out. I haven't registered the final push where I have actually managed to get the bearing out, but I registered the footage just after that. So this is how it looks like. And then it's basically to gently pull the axle out of the gearbox, out of the bearing area and away from the car. So the next thing we're going to do is to remove the CV joint from CV axle. And as I said, I have a dedicated video for just that. So if you're interested in details about this process that we are going to go through now, please check the description below for a link to the video that will explain only this part, or check the reference at the end of the video. But now I'm going to speed this part up to save up the overall time of the video. Okay, so now we have removed the old CV joint and now we will install the new one. Before we do that, I'm going to go through the parts that I have ordered and make sure that you give your VIN number while ordering the new CV joint, because it's quite easy to get the incorrect one. So when you order CV joint, it should come together as a set of items necessary for the installation. So you will get rubber boot, then you will get 2 clamps, one for the large end, one for the small end, a locking nut, the one that we have removed at the beginning, and a metal locking ring that will lock the joint onto the axle. Regarding the CV joint itself, it can either come already greased, or you can have the joint that is dry and then a separate tube of grease that is inside the box, and then you will need to grease it yourself. In my case, the joint is already greased, so there's a cap on one end preventing the grease from leaking out of the joint. Now, when it comes to the assembly, first thing we want to do, we want to install the metal clamp on the axle, and then afterwards we put the rubber boot on the axle as well. Good practice is to grease the smaller diameter of the boot with a bit of grease from the CV joint, because it will be easier to push it onto the axle. It actually is quite hard to press rubber boot onto the axle, so it helps a lot, and since it's difficult, it's going to be difficult to remove it as well, and even more difficult when we clamp it at the end. In the next step, we will take the small metal ring, the locking ring, and we will install it onto the CV axle. There's a dedicated groove for that ring in the axle, and you will need to press it into the groove. Once the ring is in the groove, it can rotate freely. Now we take the largest component, which is the CV joint, and we press it onto the axle. The metal ring that we have just installed will try to make it difficult for us, so what I recommend you to do is, while you're pressing 2 components onto each other, try to take 2 flat screwdrivers and press the metal locking ring inside the groove on the axle, and then once a tiny bit is inside, you can just hit the axle into the CV joint or the joint onto the axle, and the job is done. Once the metal ring has passed through the whole interface in the CV joint, it will expand at the end and then prevent the CV joint from falling off the axle. Next, we obviously put the other end of the rubber boot over the CV joint, and afterwards we clamp it. For clamping it, there's actually a special tool that you can use. I do not have that tool, obviously. I'm missing many tools, I guess, but you can use a simpler tool to do that, but I can't recommend you to do it because there's a dedicated tool that you can use. So if you have a chance, buy it before you replace the joint. If you don't have the money or time to buy it, you can also use another tool, the same way as I have done that. I've driven 3000 kilometers after making this video and there's nothing wrong with the joint, so I guess it works. Another advice I can give you on this part of the job is to use a good base tension of the clamps. So you can use a screwdriver, same as I have done for the small one, to create a good base tension before you start squeezing the part of the clamp with the tool. The better base tension you apply, the less you need to squeeze afterwards to get the good result. Now, when we've done all that, we can prepare to put the axle back in place. And as part of this preparation, I would recommend to take some sandpaper and clean the area where the bearing sits in, and then grease it. You can also grease the part of the axle that comes in contact with the seal located in the gearbox. And this is also the best time to replace this seal. It costs from $5 to $10, so it's not really a big deal. And it's always better to replace the seal while you're doing the job, because with time the rubber gets harder, older, and then you can have a leak afterwards. So if you're already doing that, you can as well just replace the seal. I'll make another video and show you how to do that, not to make this one too long. Onto the left side. This is how the left axle looks like. It's much shorter and it doesn't have the bearing in the middle, and therefore it's very easy to remove it. You basically do everything the same way as you have done it for the right side, but you forget all the story with the middle bearing, and therefore you don't use almost any force to pull the whole axle out of the gearbox. So I will not focus on removing it, but I want to show you how to install it. When you start to install the axle onto the gearbox, you will see that the first part of the axle has a diameter that is much smaller than the diameter of the seal. And that's because you need to put the axle much further into the gearbox before the proper part, much thicker part of the axle engages the seal. And I'll show you that in this video. And remember that when you're putting the axle inside, don't press it in, don't use force. Just turn it a bit, gently push it inside, turn it a bit once more, push it inside, don't rush it, take it step by step until the whole axle engages the seal in the proper way. Okay, so now I believe we have covered the differences between the left and the right side, and we can go back to the right side and do the rest of the installation. When you struggle to put the CV joint back in place, remember that you can always use the steering wheel to position the spindle at the most comfortable angle for you to work on the CV joint. That helped me a lot, and I want to share it with you because that makes a huge difference. When CV joint is finally back in place, we need to reconnect the spindle to the shock absorber. So we need to dig out the two bolts that we've removed and we need to put them back. Don't also forget about locking the intermediate bearing in place. To do that, you need to rotate the two locking pins back to the original position so that they prevent the bearing from misplacing, and then tighten two nuts that are on the opposite side of the assembly. Next, we need to install the drive shaft retaining nut back in place, put the wheel on, bolt it on, set it on the ground, take an adjustable key size 36 and set it to 325 Nm. Yes, it's quite a lot. And then it's only to tighten the nut. Once this is done, we need to remove the wheel once more. I told you it's a lot of this back and forth with the wheel. And then we can install the locking cap on the nut we have just tightened. Then when the cap is in place, we need to lock it using the locking pin. And then you can also help yourself with the flat screwdriver to get over the parts of the cap where there's groove. At the end, don't forget to tighten your wheel bolts with the correct momentum, and don't forget to fill in your transmission oil. You will not go too far without it. To fill the oil, we use the interface on top of the gearbox. There used to be a vent cap on top, but we have removed it at the beginning of the video. And as I said a few times already, I have a dedicated video on draining and filling in the oil, so please check it out if you're wondering about what oil to fill in, how much. All the details are there, and you can also use the reference at the end of the video, of course. Remember to reinstall the vent cap and the airline at the end, and that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and if you'd like to see more Peugeot 307 mechanics, check my channel out. I've got plenty of videos about this car, and good luck with your Peugeot.